Hey guys, welcome to my interview prep series videos. I'm going to be talking about array reduce. In one of the previous videos, I talked about array reduce when I was talking about data structures. In that video, I briefly introduced array reduce for JavaScript, and I basically talked about what it does. So in this video, I'm going to start by doing a quick review of what the array reduce does and kind of its syntax in PHP, because this video is going to be in PHP. And then we will be talking about a more engaged example with array reduced. In future videos, I hope to do more examples on array reduce because it's one of my own favorite methods that can be used on arrays, and that can be very helpful in real-world applications. So first of all, let's look at the syntax. So what are the input parameters to array reduce? Well, array reduce, first of all, what it does is it goes through the elements of an array one by one or iteratively, and it reduces the array to a single value using a callback function. So that would make sense for the first input parameter to be an array. Then we pass in the callback function. So we pass in a callable, just the callback function. And then finally, we have an optional initial value, which in this case I'm not going to put it in here in the syntax, but it's just going to be a optional initial value. Usually when we're reducing an array, in a lot of the cases it's just going to be an empty array, which initializes what we're going to be passing into it later. So let's talk about the callback function. The callback function is also important. It's going to have a carry or accumulator. So we're just gonna say mixed. It will have carry. Later in the video, we're just gonna call it accumulator and item. Oops, $sign. This carry will start from whatever the initialized value is. Then whatever the value from the previous iteration is going to be saved inside carry. So item is the current iteration's value, so whichever element inside the array we are on right now. So let's say we have 1, 2, 3, and we are applying and the callable is going to be a sum function, for example. So what this is going to do is the item is going to be, in the first iteration, is going to be 1. So it will add 1 to the initial value, which is going to be 1. So that's going to be iteration 1. So the next iteration is going to carry 1 with itself, that's why it's called carry or accumulator. And then item, which is the current item, the current iteration value. So the current iteration is now on 2, so it's not on 1 anymore. So it will be 1 plus 2. So the next iteration is gonna save 3 inside carry. So carry then passes 3 to the next iteration. Item is gonna be 3, and this reduce method is going to return 6 to us. And it doesn't necessarily have to be an array either. That's only if we pass in an array as an initial as a initial parameter. If not, it will just return an integer 6 to us. Now that we understand this better, we will move to an example, which is actually from the PHP manual site. Next video, I will try to put together another example myself and go over that example, but I thought this was a really good example to start. So let's look at the example that we're going to cover. So in this example, we are going to group an array. What this is going to do is it's going to first grab an array and make it easier to iterate through and easier to interpret. This is a really useful thing to know whenever, especially for whenever you're working with a large data and you need to group them by something and you need to group them by an index so you can iterate through them easier. So in this case, we have an array of people. So people consists of 5 people, and these people are related to each other. So these people are related to each other, and the relationship they have with each other are father and son. So how do you know? Tom and Linus are children of Peter. How do I know? That's by the key dad. So we have a key dad that says which child is the child of which dad. So we have another child here whose dad is Haley. So Haley and Peter are fathers. They don't have a key, a dad key. Linus, Jack, and Tom are children, and the way we know it is because they have a dad key. So that's the main thing. So that's the first thing that we need to understand. But that's kind of complex way to set up father-children relations in this array. And if you were to print out all the children to, let's say, Peter, you'd have to be iterating through a lot, the entire array basically, and you'd have to be looking for wherever the dad key's value matches with the ID of Peter, and all of that is just a lot of work to do. And the reduce method will organize and group this array and reduce it for us so that we can easily iterate through the array and print out all the fathers, all the children to each father, and so on. So let's get started. In order to do this, we first create a new array, which we are going to be saving the reduced array inside of this variable, and we're going to call it family. So we apply the array reduce method to the existing people array. So if you remember, we had the array and then we had a callable. So the main thing and the most challenging part of incorporating the reduce method or the array reduce method is writing the callable. So the callable is going to be a function, and it is going to be doing most of the work, or basically all the work for us. So the callable function is going to have a accumulator which will store the reduced array inside a new array in every iteration. And then the item is going to be the element at each iteration. So in this case, the element at each iteration is going to be each person inside the people array. Now we need to see. So inside of our array, the new array, we want to group we want to group our array by the dad. So we're gonna have dad groups. So the way we do that is we need to create that. We need to create dads, and then we need to create children of those dads, and then add them to their fathers. So the way we do that is we're gonna have two overall cases. One of them is if we are dealing with a dad or if we're not dealing with the dad in the current iteration. So let's say the first iteration is not a dad, which is the case in this people array. So in that case, we will say we need to check if the current item is a dad. So if it does not have a dad, so if you don't have a dad key, that means you're a dad yourself. So we say if is set item, so item was again the current item we're dealing with, does not have a dad key. So if it does not have a dad, we will save the ID of this dad. We will save the name of this dad. So the next one is kind of tricky. So if this dad, so let's say we are on the first iteration. We are a dad, so we're gonna grab the ID, we're gonna grab the name, and then the next thing is storing the children of the dad that we have found so far, that we've stored so far. In this case, it's going to be an empty array, but let's say we get to here. We've already stored Linus inside Peter's dad array. So we need to add, so when we get to Peter, so before getting to Peter, we've already created Linus as a child. So here we need to add Linus to Peter. So the way we do that is we create a children variable, and then we say if inside accumulator with the ID of this dad. So for the ID of this dad, if we have a children array stored, then we're going to save it inside children. If not, we're going to give empty. So we know accumulator is going to give us everything that we've saved so far. So the accumulator is going to have ID. So let's say we get to Peter. At Peter, accumulator is going to be 4 accumulator ID. So we're going to have accumulator ID of 4. So we will say for ID of 4, do we have any children saved? Yes, we have this. So this children is going to be this array, basically. If not, it's going to be empty array. So then, after we've added the children, we will add the dad to the accumulator. And when we add the dad to the accumulator, we will save its ID and we will also pass its name. And we will also pass a children key and pass in children array as the value to the key. And then we need to return accumulator, because that's what we do at the end of each iteration. We return the accumulator, which is everything that we've saved so far. So what happened here, okay, all right, so next, now we're outside of this if statement. So now we're outside of this if statement. So now let's say we're on a child. So what do? First of all, we add the dad. So if we're on a child, we're gonna have a key dad inside the item. We will save that as a dad variable. So that's gonna be the dad of the child. So we basically created a dad. Then we say if this dad has not been set or has not been added to the accumulator yet. So we're basically saying if the father of this child has not been added to the accumulator yet, that's what this if is set is false, meaning accumulator dad. So the dad does not exist in accumulator. So we're saying if we haven't reached the father of a child, so that means if we reach a child, let's say we reach Linus, and we don't have Linus's dad inside accumulator yet. So meaning that accumulator with the ID of 4 does not exist anymore. So we're saying so that's basically if we reach a child before we reach his father. What we do is we add to the accumulator, we add the dad's ID to the accumulator, and we pass in the current item as a child to that father, and we pass in the current item as a child to that father to our accumulator. So what that means is that when we hit Linus, we need to store Linus inside Peter's subarray of children, but we don't have Peter in accumulator yet. So what we do is we pre-create Peter basically, and we add Linus to him, and then when we get to Peter, we search for children of Peter that we found before we found Peter, and we add Linus to Peter. So we added the child to the dad, and we return accumulator again. So this part of the code basically is dealing with when we hit a child. So when we hit a child, there are two ways that we deal with it. We either have not hit the father yet, so we pre-create the father and we add the child to him, or we have already hit the father. So let's say we're on Tom, so we already have Peter in our accumulator. So all we do is this time we add the child to the children array, and we create and we add it to the children subarray. So the children subarray already exists, and we add the current item, which is the next child, to the children subarray, and then we finally return accumulator again, and we need to make sure that we pass an empty array initially as a initial variable. Like we said, we need an initial variable, um, that accumulator keeps um, the accumulator keeps storing values inside. So we can then do a print r on family. We'll and run. Well, I had a spelling error and that gave me a little bit of time. Um, yeah. I bet everyone hates spelling errors. But basically we can see what we did over here. So we add the dads over here. So we deal with the cases, we deal with dads in this if statement. So we create dads in this if statement and we add them to the accumulator inside this if statement. We deal with children whose dads we haven't reached yet in this if statement. We deal with the rest of children here, and we add the children that came before their fathers to their father here, and we add the rest of the children here. We add, and this accumulator is being created over here for whenever we reach a child for the first time whose dad doesn't exist. This one for whenever we reach a child whose dad exists. And you see we add the next child to an empty array. So we add over here, we have the children key, which is this one. We have the children key already created. Over here we are creating the children key, and so as you can see now, instead of having just a bunch of arrays not knowing who's who, we have fathers in one level, and then we have sub arrays or second level of arrays with their children. And these are their children because we grouped them by the father's ID. So we grouped them by the father's ID. We always grouped the accumulator by the father's ID. So now let's look at, we can make that even prettier. Yep, this is a little prettier, whichever you prefer to see. I think this one is more spacious. But we can also look at it this way as well. So there are minor differences. For example, the key for in the print R is the father's keys. So we pass accumulator ID, so that's the father's key. I like that. In a lot of cases, maybe we want to get the ID from the key, but then also in this one we have just 0 and 1, so we can just iterate and look for I equals 0 and 1. So that's one benefit to showing the array like this. And again, the same thing, we have the father, we have its children, and that was the end of this example. I hope you guys enjoyed, and in the next videos I hope to do examples with you guys. I'll do my best to reach out to other developers or software engineers and try to make a time work and create a video with another developer. Again, with that, Thank you for watching and happy coding!